This is important. What I'm about to show you took me 20 years to piece together. Spinoza saw it 400 years ago. The church tried to destroy it. Don't click away until you've seen the evidence.
There is a belief so embedded in Western Christianity that most people have never thought to ask where it came from. You were born guilty, not guilty of something you chose, not guilty of something you did or thought or decided, guilty before you drew your first breath, guilty before you had the equipment to make a moral choice at all, guilty because a man and a woman in a garden made a decision before you existed, and that decision passed its contamination forward through every generation of human life, right down to the moment you arrived in the world. You carry Adam's sin. That is what the doctrine says. That is what baptism addresses. That is what confession is designed to relieve. That is what the entire architecture of sin and redemption and grace is built on managing. The technical term is original sin, and I need to tell you something about it. That doctrine does not appear in the original Hebrew Bible, not in Genesis, not in the Torah, not in the prophets, not in the Psalms, not in Job, not in Ezekiel. The concept of inherited guilt, the idea that a transgression committed in a garden before recorded history transmitted itself forward through every subsequent generation, contaminating every human being who has ever lived with a moral stain they did not earn, is not there. The Hebrew Bible that Christianity claims as its Old Testament does not contain the foundational doctrine of Western Christianity. I'm going to take you through the documents that explain how that happened. And I mean documents, actual texts, actual manuscripts, an actual council meeting with an actual list of bishops who attended, and an actual vote with an actual date. The 1st of May, 418 of the Common Era. A city in North Africa, 214 bishops, 8 canons. And among those 8 canons, one that declared that anyone who denied original sin was anathema. Cursed, cast out. But before I get to that room and that vote, I want to tell you about a man whose name you have probably not heard. A man who read the same texts everyone else was reading, who read them carefully and in the original languages, and who concluded that what the texts actually said was quite different from what the institution was teaching. He was declared a heretic. His writings were burned. What survives of his position comes almost entirely from the writings of the man who destroyed him. I will tell you his name in a moment, and I will tell you why the institution could not tolerate what he was saying, and why the reason had far less to do with theology than with something much older and much more consistent across the history of religious power. But I want to begin at the beginning, because the beginning is the text, and the text is the argument. Genesis chapter 3. That is where this all supposedly starts. The garden, the serpent, the fruit, the expulsion. Most people know the outline. What most people have not done is read the Hebrew text of that chapter slowly, with attention to what it says and what it does not say. In the Hebrew text of Genesis 3, what happens is this. Adam and Eve disobey a direct instruction from God. They eat from the tree they were told not to eat from. The consequences are immediate and concrete. Pain in childbirth, hard labor against difficult soil, expulsion from the garden. The ground is cursed. The serpent is cursed. There is shame about nakedness. There are garments made from animal skins. There is the cherubim with the flaming sword at the eastern entrance. What is not there is any statement that this transgression passes to their descendants. No text in Genesis 3 says that Adam's children will be born carrying his guilt. No verse says the moral contamination of this act transmits forward through human lineage. The consequences described are structural: mortality, difficult labor, expulsion from a state of original intimacy with the divine, but they are not described as a heritable moral stain that every subsequent human being inherits from birth. Now, there is a piece of the Hebrew Bible that is even more direct than Genesis 3 on this question, not obscure, not peripheral, from one of the major prophets. Ezekiel chapter 18, verse 20. I want to read you what it says. The soul that sins shall die. The son shall not suffer for the iniquity of the father, nor the father suffer for the iniquity of the son. The righteousness of the righteous shall be upon himself, and the wickedness of the wicked shall be upon himself. That is not ambiguous. That is not a passage requiring careful interpretive nuance to understand. The son does not carry the father's sin, Moral responsibility, in the explicit position of the prophetic tradition, is individual and non-transferable. Each person answers for what they themselves have done. What is more, in the Hebrew ethical vocabulary, to say otherwise, to claim that children bear inherited moral liability for the acts of their ancestors, is precisely what God is described here as not doing. It is presented as a departure from justice, not an expression of it. The rabbinic tradition, working through these same texts over centuries, built accordingly. You are born with the capacity for both good and evil, and your life is the working out of your choices between them, not the inheritance of someone else's failure, your own. And here is the thing that most introductions to this question never quite say plainly enough to feel like it has been said. Jesus of Nazareth was a Jew. He was born into this tradition. He taught in synagogues. He debated within the categories of first-century Jewish thought. And in all four of the canonical Gospels, in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John taken together, Jesus never once mentions the doctrine of original sin. Not once. He does not teach that inherited moral contamination is the central problem of human existence. He teaches about the kingdom of God, about repentance, about love of neighbor, about hypocrisy in religious institutions. He does not teach what Augustine of Hippo will later call peccatum originale. The most fundamental doctrine of the Christianity that claims to follow him is not part of what he taught. I am not sure there is a gentler way to put that, and I am not going to try to find one. Now, I said I would tell you about the biblical text that was used to create the doctrine, because what Paul actually wrote in Greek is not what the doctrine is built on. What the doctrine is built on is a translation, and I want to show you exactly where the translation went. And I want to warn you before I do that what you're about to see makes it very difficult to read the relevant passage the same way again. If you want to stop here before the mechanism is fully visible, I understand. But I think you should stay. Romans chapter 5, verse 12. In the Greek text of Paul's letter to the Romans, this verse contains a phrase that is the pivot on which the entire debate turns. The phrase in Greek is ev ho pantes hematon. Ev ho, because or inasmuch as, a causal connective. Pantes, or, hematon, sinned. Put them together, and what Paul wrote reads, because all sinned. It is a statement about universal human behavior. Every human being sins. A moral universal, not an inherited legal status, but a description of what all people do. Now, the Latin translation. Jerome, working in the late 4th century, produced the Latin Vulgate, the translation of the Christian scriptures that became the official Bible of the Western Church for over a millennium. And in his translation of Romans 5:12, Jerome rendered the Greek phrase as in quo omnes peccaverunt, in whom all sinned, not because all sinned, in whom all sinned, in whom referring to Adam. The sin is located in Adam as a vessel in which all subsequent humanity participated, not each person sinning individually. All of humanity sinning in Adam collectively at the moment of the fall, hereditarily. That is not what the Greek says. The Greek says because. Jerome's Latin says in whom. The grammatical difference between those two translations is the difference between a universal description of human moral behavior and a doctrine of inherited guilt. And now the detail that I find very difficult to set aside. Augustine of Hippo, the man who built the doctrine of original sin into the permanent architecture of Western Christianity, who spent decades developing and defending it, did not read Greek with confidence. He acknowledged this himself. He worked primarily in Latin, and his theology of original sin, the theology that the Council of Carthage would codify into mandatory doctrine in 418, was built on Jerome's Latin translation, not on the Greek original. He never checked the Greek. I need to tell you about the night that I understood the full weight of that. It was a winter evening in Norwich, late enough that the street outside my study had gone quiet, that particular quality of stillness that comes to an English residential street sometime after 11, when the last cars have passed, and even the cold seems to hold its breath. I'd been preparing materials for a postgraduate seminar on Pauline theology. I was doing something I did not always make time for in ordinary teaching preparation, working through both the Greek New Testament and Jerome's Latin Vulgate simultaneously side by side, tracking the translation choices that had shaped the received text. I had the Greek open on one side of the desk, the Vulgate on the other. I was working through Romans 5, annotating both versions. When I reached verse 12, I wrote the two key phrases out on a sheet of paper, one beneath the other. F ho pantes hematon, in quo omnes peccaverunt. I put the pen down, because what I was looking at was not a minor translation ambiguity. It was not the kind of variance that occurs in any translation when the target language lacks a precise equivalent. What I was looking at was the grammatical foundation of a doctrine that had shaped the inner life of hundreds of millions of people across 16 centuries. And it was not in the Greek. It was in Jerome's Latin. And Augustine, the man who turned that Latin phrase into the cornerstone of Western Christian anthropology, had never gone back to the original to verify it. The mug of tea on the desk had gone cold. I had not noticed until that moment. There was a clock somewhere in the house, an old pendulum clock that had been my father's, and I became aware of it in a way I had not been all evening, the tick of it, very steady in the silence. I had taught this doctrine for years. I had used Romans 5:12 as the textual anchor of lectures on sin and redemption and the necessity of baptismal grace. I had taught it with the confidence that comes from having been taught with confidence. And it had not occurred to me to put the two versions side by side and look at what they actually said. The feeling was not anger. It was something quieter than anger, and slower to arrive. The feeling of realizing that a structural wall you had trusted was never actually connected to the foundation you thought it was resting on. Not the noise of a collapse. The cold, gradual certainty that the ground is different from what you thought. I will tell you this. A scholar I had been following for some years described this particular mistranslation as one of the most consequential in the history of the Christian tradition. That is not my phrase, but it is accurate. Now forget for a moment everything about Paul and Jerome and Augustine. I want to tell you about a man who arrived in Rome around the turn of the 5th century and read exactly what I just read you, who read the Greek of Romans 5, who read the Hebrew of Genesis 3, who read Ezekiel 18, and who concluded from those readings that the tradition had built a doctrine that the text did not support. His name was Pelagius. He was a monk, British, possibly Irish. The sources are vague, which is itself part of the story of what happened to him. Well educated in classical learning, and he read Greek fluently. He read Romans 5:12 in the Greek. And what he concluded from the Greek text was this: human beings are born morally neutral, not corrupted, not carrying an inherited stain from Adam, capable of choosing good or evil, exactly in the tradition of Ezekiel 18, exactly in the tradition of the Hebrew ethical framework, exactly as the letter to the Romans reads when you read it in the language Paul wrote it in. Each person answers for their own moral life. Grace matters. The teaching and example of Jesus matters enormously. But the starting condition of a human being is not one of intrinsic corruption requiring sacramental correction. That was what the text said. That was what Pelagius was saying. And that is the position for which Pelagius was eventually declared a heretic. But here is what I want you to notice about that sequence, because it requires very careful attention. The theological argument Pelagius was making had a consequence that went beyond theology. If human beings can act morally without being entirely dependent on the institutional mediation of divine grace, if you do not arrive in the world carrying a legal guilt that only baptism can address, if you are not in a state of ongoing spiritual emergency that only the sacramental system can manage, then the institutional church loses something fundamental. It loses its necessity. Original sin, as Augustine developed it, creates a problem. Inherited guilt, total corruption, a human nature incapable of genuine good without grace mediated through the church's sacraments that only the church's institutional system can address. Remove original sin, and the church becomes valuable, perhaps deeply valuable, as a community of teaching and practice and spiritual formation. But it is no longer the indispensable mechanism of salvation. It is no longer the only thing standing between a corrupted humanity and divine judgment. That was what was at stake. Not merely a question of Greek grammar, the institutional architecture of Western Christianity. And Pelagius had a following. His ideas had spread into North Africa. into Augustine's territory, and then something happened that was less theological than it was political. In the year 410, Alaric and his Visigoths sacked Rome. I want you to hold that for a moment, not as a historical footnote, but as a civilizational shock. Rome had not been sacked by an external enemy in 800 years. The city that called itself eternal, the center of the world as late Roman civilization understood it, was pillaged. The trauma was not only military. Pagans were blaming Christianity for it. They argued that the old Roman civic religion, the one that had built the empire, had been replaced with a faith that taught men to turn the other cheek and hope for heaven, rather than defend their city with discipline and force. The question of whether Christianity had weakened Rome was, in 410, not a marginal provocation. It was the central political question of the moment. Augustine's response was the masterwork of his life, De Civitate Dei, the city of God. It took him over a decade to write, and running through it, giving it its theological backbone, was the doctrine of original sin. The world is fallen, Augustine argued, because humanity fell in Adam. The suffering you see around you, the violence, the collapse of earthly powers, the apparent injustice of a history that grinds down the righteous and elevates the wicked, is the consequence of that original transgression. The city of man is built on a corrupted foundation, and it will always fail, because humanity is corrupted. Only the city of God offers genuine hope. The political utility of that framework was not accidental. If the fall of Rome is the consequence of Adam's sin, rather than the failure of Christian influence, then Christianity is absolved of responsibility for the catastrophe. The solution follows not political reform, but sacramental participation, submission to the ecclesiastical structure that offered grace in the face of a corruption no human effort alone could address. I am not saying Augustine cynically manufactured a doctrine for political convenience. I believe he genuinely believed what he taught, but the sincerity of a belief and its institutional utility are not mutually exclusive. They can reinforce each other in ways that make them very difficult to separate. And what happened next sits in the purely institutional record. A letter survived, and that letter changes the picture considerably. Pope Zosimus became the Bishop of Rome in 417. One of the first things he did was review the case against Pelagius and against Celestius, Pelagius's closest associate. Zosimus read the documents, he heard the arguments, and he issued a formal finding. He absolved them. He declared that Pelagius and Celestius had been condemned unjustly, that their theology did not constitute heresy, that those who had accused them should be ashamed. He wrote to the African bishops, and Augustine among them, and told them so directly. The African bishops refused to accept this. And then the Emperor Honorius intervened. In 418, Honorius issued an imperial rescript, an order at the level of Roman imperial law, declaring Pelagians to be disturbers of the peace and ordering them expelled from Rome. Not a theological condemnation, an administrative one, a security measure. Pelagians were now, by imperial decree, a public order problem. Within months, Zosimus reversed his position. The man who had formally declared Pelagius orthodox in 417 condemned him as a heretic in 418. His theological assessment of the evidence did not change. The power that stood behind the throne did. I'm going to tell you something before I take you into the council chamber. I remember a seminar in Durham, sometime in the middle of the 1990s. I was teaching a course on Augustinian theology. There was a student in that room, quiet, always in the front row, the kind of person who listened more carefully than almost anyone else in the room, and who asked the questions that stayed with you. Somewhere in a session on the Pelagian controversy, he raised his hand and asked quite quietly, if original sin comes from Adam, and if the doctrine is derived from the Hebrew scriptures, why do Jewish people not believe it? They have the same texts. I gave him the standard answer, that it is a matter of interpretive tradition, of how texts are read within different communities. I said it with the confidence of someone who had taught the material many times. He nodded, wrote something in his notebook, did not ask a follow-up. I walked back to my office after that session and could not start the next thing I had planned, because I had given him a management of the question, not an answer to it. I had not told him about Ezekiel 18. I had not told him about the difference between the Greek and the Latin of Romans 5. I had not said those things because, at that point in my own work, I had not yet fully confronted them myself. Now, the 1st of May, 418, Carthage. 214 bishops assembled. The count varies slightly depending on which list of signatories you follow. Some sources give 200, some 217, but the order of magnitude is consistent and the historical documentation is clear. This was not a small regional gathering. Bishops were present from North Africa, from Spain, from across the territories of the African Church. Aurelius of Carthage presided. Augustine of Hippo was present. The agenda was the Pelagian question, and before the sessions closed, they voted on 8 canons. Let me read you 2 of them. Canon 1. If anyone says that Adam, the first man, was made mortal, so that whether he sinned or not, he would have died in body. That is, he would have departed from the body not as a punishment for sin, but by reason of the necessity of nature. Let him be anathema. Canon 2. If anyone denies that newly born infants are to be baptized, or says that they are baptized for the remission of sins, but that they derive no original sin from Adam, which is to be washed away in the bath of regeneration, let him be anathema. Anathema, a Greek word, cast out, cursed. The Council of Carthage declared that anyone who denied that infants were born carrying the guilt of Adam's transgression, anyone who read the Hebrew Bible and the Greek New Testament and arrived at the position that Pelagius had arrived at, was anathema. That was not a theological suggestion. That was a formal ecclesiastical declaration with consequences that would operate across the entirety of Western Christendom. Now I want to place the Greek of Paul against the canon that was just passed, side by side, as I promised. 1 Paul wrote, Evschopantes hematon, because all sinned, a causal statement, a description of universal human behavior. Every person in Paul's analysis has sinned. A pastoral observation about the moral condition of humanity. What the council declared mandatory. Original sin from Adam to be washed away in baptism. Not because all sinned. In Adam all sinned, hereditarily, transmissibly, in a form requiring sacramental remedy to remove. That distance between what Paul wrote in Greek and what the council declared anathema to deny is the distance between a description of human behavior and a doctrine that required an institution to remedy it. Paul wrote about what people do. The council legislated about what people are from the moment of birth. I want to tell you about a conversation I had at a theological conference in the west of England. I would place it around 2007 or 2008, though I cannot be certain of the exact year. The kind of conference where the formal sessions are almost secondary, where the substantive exchange happens in corridors between sessions, over pour coffee from a table near the stairs, in a voice somewhat lower than the one used for official proceedings. I was speaking with a scholar who had spent a career working on Augustinian theology, someone I had read for years, well published, well regarded in the field. We were standing in a corridor between the morning session and lunch. He said something quietly, not whispering, but with the particular register of a man choosing his words deliberately. He said, "The Acts of the Council of Carthage read more like a political document than a theological one." He said it without flourish. Then he glanced along the corridor. Then he smiled. Not a happy smile, more the kind of smile that acknowledges something without quite opening to it. And then he added, very evenly, "But you will never find that in print." Someone he knew walked past. The conversation moved on. I have thought about that corridor many times since, about what it means when someone who knows the material fully says the most honest thing he has to say in a hallway between sessions, and then returns to the managed version in the published work. Not because he is dishonest, because the institutions in which he operates have their own gravitational field, the same field that operated in Carthage in 418. Spinoza, writing in the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus in 1670, described this mechanism with precision. He argued that ecclesiastical councils function as political mechanisms as much as theological ones, shaped not only by evidence and sincerity of argument, but by power relations, by alliances between ecclesiastical and civil authority, by the institutional stakes of the outcome. He wrote this about the councils of his own era, but the Tractatus reads, at those passages, as if he is describing Carthage. Pelagius was declared a heretic. His writings were gathered and burned. The destruction was systematic enough that today almost everything we know about his actual theology comes from Augustine's accounts, from the writing of the man who destroyed him. We are reading Pelagius through his prosecutor's summary. The defense has been lost. What fragments survive suggest a man who was carefully reading the original texts, who was saying, in essence, the Hebrew Bible says each person answers for their own acts. The Greek of Romans says because all sinned, not in whom all sinned. The tradition in which Jesus taught never developed inherited guilt. What exactly are we defending? He was destroyed for asking those questions. And here is what I cannot make peace with, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. The mechanism that destroyed Pelagius was not primarily theological, it was political. The imperial rescript came first. The papal reversal followed. The council vote codified it. In 418, the political machinery of the late Roman Empire and the ecclesiastical machinery of the African Church moved together to define a doctrine and declare all questioning of it cursed. The problem, inherited guilt, total corruption, a human nature incapable of genuine good without institutional intervention, was built into the architecture. And the institution was the answer to the problem. Baptism to address the guilt, confession to manage ongoing failure, the priesthood as the indispensable mediator. That is what Spinoza saw. Not a hostile observer, a man of extraordinary intellectual discipline who followed documents wherever they led, who asked where doctrines came from and what purposes they served, and who found, in the specific case of this doctrine, a council meeting that had more in common with a legislative session than with a theological revelation. I have sat with this for a long time before saying it from here, because I am aware of what it means to tell someone that the guilt they carried, the sense of being born wrong, of arriving in the world already in deficit, was manufactured, not by deliberate cruelty, but by the convergence of a mistranslation that was never corrected, a political crisis that required a theological framework, an imperial rescript that reversed a papal finding, and a vote by 214 bishops who declared all disagreement anathema. I am not able to tell you that knowing this liberates you. I genuinely do not know if it does. For some people, perhaps. For others, it may only make things more complicated. The question of what you build in its place, if you dismantle any part of it, is not one I am in a position to answer for you. What I can tell you is that the truth is in the documents. The documents can be read. And Spinoza showed us, 3.5 centuries ago, that reading them honestly, following them where they lead, without the management, without the official version, without the telephone call that precedes the editorial decision, is the only thing that has ever been genuinely dangerous to the institutions that have spent 16 centuries keeping them. If you made it to the end of this, write the word truth in the comments. It tells me the conversation is reaching people who are willing to follow it through, and it helps me know that continuing this work is worth doing. There is more to examine. There are more documents. And I will see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves.
Tell me in the comments, what part of this challenged you the most? I read every single one. It helps me know what to research next. We're uncovering this together.